Well, I mean, even my colleague the other day said, this person who is a CEO is an exceptional manager, really good at managing, but is not a good leader. And so, like, even with support, there are ways of doing things in an organization, like in Phil's company, like they've done it a certain way for so long because it works. And, why change if it's working? But if you're a really good executor, if you're really good tactically, you could kind of project manage your way through it. But, the question is like, is that strategy, is that really getting the most out of it? Are you having to kind of police people or micromanage versus being able to empower? And so it's a choice, like all things, and it creates a certain environment. And then the question is, for any leader, any team, is that what you want? And are you going to get the best results out of it? So I did the strategic planning for the Reserve Bank of Fiji, and they had 40 people in the room. And I haven't seen everything from every part at the end of it, but I would say, hey, for them, that made a lot of sense. For another organization, I had 2 people in the room, and that was exactly what they needed. But I would say kind of 7 to 11, you have your executive leadership or your board or both. Having both is hard. One or the two, and then that is typically around 12 people. I'd say after 12 people, diminishing returns. I think at least 5, only if it makes sense.
Welcome to the Long-Term Strategic Planning Conference 2025 with my guest, Anthony Taylor. So imagine this. You're an executive in a company which has never had a strategic planning retreat. In the past, the top 2 or 3 leaders would meet and make some decisions between themselves. Then they would announce them. The results? A lack of buy-in and comprehension. Now you're looking at other ways of doing strategy differently, but are not sure how or even why. What happens if you get a group involved? And how can you convince others, your colleagues, to depart from prior practice? I'm Francis Wade, your conference host, and here today to tackle this thorny problem is my guest, Anthony Taylor, who will draw from his considerable experience so that we can solve this problem together. Anthony, welcome to the conference.
Thanks for having me. It's a blast.
Great. So, who is Anthony? Well, Anthony C. Taylor is the CEO at SME Strategy Consulting. He facilitates team alignment and supports transformational change in teams in North America and around the world. He's a father to 2 boys and lives in Vancouver, Canada. And as usual, we'll start off with a story, and this story is about Phil. Phil is a leader in an organization in which the severe lack of collaboration is killing him. He sees a better way. He has a vision. He wants everyone to run fast. However, he's noticed that the decision making is poor. He wants a solution that will make everyone work together on the same thing. People like it there. He likes it there. But sometimes politics, processes, and the status quo gets in the way. And that stops massive progress. And he asks himself, why can't our team be like the others he's been a part of? So fast forward to today, and he's really nervous. They've heard about strategic planning retreats at other companies, but he's not sure if they need one. At his last job, for example, they had retreats, but he never attended. He was too low in the pecking order. He doesn't quite know why one has not been scheduled, like one has been scheduled, because they get along and they're all pretty smart people. So why do they even need a retreat? Can't they do some team building instead? The strategic planning retreat is coming up, and this is the first one in over a decade. No one on the team has attended a retreat either, and some feel as if it's not needed. After all, the CEO, the CFO, and Phil, the 3 of them, could do a good job on their own and maybe announce a strategy to the rest of the folks in the company. He's conflicted and maybe a little bit confused. So, Anthony, have you met someone like a Phil before?
I mean, I'll tell you, I was Phil. I've seen this all the time. It's such a challenging place to be in because everybody wants to do what's best, but sometimes you think you know better or could do it, and it was just it's a tough challenge for any leader to be in, to try to find that right balance, that right line for what to do, and just try to understand where that organization is at and where they're at.
right? Especially if you're a leader who likes to take control, and you're so you're someone who likes to control a narrative. And when it comes to developing the narrative, you do want your hands on all of it. And if you could keep it to yourself, I know there's lots of very sort of narcissistic CEOs who they still develop the strategy on their own and they simply announce it to the others. And that's it. That's a strategy, and it's a communication problem as opposed to some other kind of problem. Have you had to? Well, these people don't usually call people like you and I, but have you run into them, and what do you say to people like that?
Well, I mean, even my colleague the other day said, this person who is a CEO is an exceptional manager, really good at managing, but is not a good leader. And so, like, even with support, there are ways of doing things in an organization, like in Phil's company, like they've done it a certain way for so long because it works. And, why change if it's working? But if you're a really good executor, if you're really good tactically, you could kind of project manage your way through it.
Hmm.
But the question is, like, is that strategy, is that really getting the most out of it? Are you having to kind of police people or micromanage versus being able to empower? And so it's a choice, like all things, and it creates a certain environment. And then the question is, for any leader, any team, is that what you want, and are you going to get the best results out of it?
Right. So a leader could argue, I get the best results because look at my results, and they could look to the past, and I'm sure that's a lot is happening right now, when as the world goes into this tumultuous state with all of the disruptions and unexpected surprises, that there's a tendency for the big boss, male or female, to revert to type and be more authoritarian and just say, I figured things out in the past. I'll figure this one out. And I wonder if you've seen his colleagues, kind of like Phil, wanting to get more involved, but not quite knowing how because they don't want to upset the apple cart and ruin a winning formula. Have you seen that tension between the CEO and his or her reports?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how it happened to me, to be honest. I don't know if I should share that.
Really?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's when I'm on a team, I want to contribute. I want to play. I want to win. And, if there's not the right structure, you might have somebody who's on the sidelines who like really wants to do their best. And then in organizations, because there's more people not on the executive team than the executive team, like hey, they did it with 3 people and I wasn't one of those 3. There's a lot of people who want to contribute and they don't always know how. And that was kind of my origin story of getting into this work, is because I wanted to contribute in an organization that I was on. And at the time there was no place. And then somebody had the bright idea of doing this, strategic planning session. And it was awesome. Just got to like get the most of it, learn and contribute.
Oh, I'm gonna ask you about that a little bit later as well. But it's a bit weird because I think this tension between the leader and the followers has only gotten worse in the last just since the beginning of the year. And there now seems to be a whole model emerging of I do the thinking and you do the doing. And I think in the US, that model is like playing out in front of our eyes on a big stage. And whether you think it's working or it's not working, it's definitely happening. And it's obvious that it's happening that way. And we it brings to sort of mind the question: if you're going to bring in other people, is it worth the time and effort? Because I can imagine from a Trump point of view, I made sure to take out all of the people who were not on my program the first time. And this time I have all the people who would agree with me.
Hmm.
So if he were a different kind of leader, it's isn't it tempting to say, why don't I just do it my way? That old song.
So I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole or 20-foot pole. What I will say is I think that there's a time there's a time and place for broad-based engagement, and there's a time
Mm-hmm.
for authoritative leadership. Like, for example,
Mm-hmm.
in the military,
Mm-hmm.
you're not getting soldiers around to say, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should do? Because you need a clear chain of command. And in some cases, if you're, you know, dealing with a lot of fast and reactive change, having a person to just like lead it through. However, if you're trying to accomplish something, big, overcome resistance, and you might not have the political forte, for example, you might be a middle manager, a senior manager who can't necessarily pull the strings. I was talking to somebody the other day, and he's like, I have partners that work with me, but I don't have any power over them. So how
Okay.
do you get them to buy into what you're doing? They have to follow you as a leader because there is no inherent power. You're suggesting, you're offering, you're allowing, but you don't always have power over the people that you need to get on board with what you're doing. And I think that's the nuance between leadership and driving something forward and getting other people involved versus management and dictatorship, so to speak, of dictating and saying, this is what we are doing, and here, follow these steps.
Ah, okay. So the strategy then becomes an opportunity, in the words that you've just used, to, and I think I'm going into solutions here as opposed to just diagnosing, but strategy is just one of the opportunities to engage other people.
I
Is it?
mean, it's a choice, like all things strategy, right? So if you are in this situation, you could say, hey, option A is better for me, broad based engagement. The other is, leading it and, do have the offsite, not have the offsite. There's trade offs to everything: time, money, energy trade offs, efficacy. There are some sessions you and I might have been part of that you said, I could have done this on my own and it would have been better. And so, managing that and managing the trade offs, but recognizing that there is an opportunity. And then if you're trying to drive forward an organization that might have, 50 or 60 or 100 or more staff, you have to get them on board one way or the other. Otherwise, they're going to resist. And so, again, without getting into solutions, it's whatever makes the most sense for your organization, for your people, and the culture. Some cultures don't lend to collaborative decision making because
Right.
it's not open to, if you say something, it might be seen as stepping out of line. Whereas in other cultures, you would be expected to have the opportunity. And if you didn't, it could be seen as disrespectful. So it's an interesting balance.
Right, 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 right. Um, and I wonder if you, as you compare the two, is it true that better strategy comes from more collaboration, or is that just sometimes?
Another trade-off. I was like leading a session recently, and it's happened many times where there are many people involved in the decision making. Okay, that has benefits to it, but if you've ever heard the expression like too many cooks in the kitchen, how many people do you really need? I joke and I say as many people as necessary, but not more. And so, like, what is that?
That's a good one.
So, yeah, I think that there is, and it's interesting that there is no answer per se, but I would say that they're generally accepted principles of what would be helpful. Another group that I was with, there was a 20 something person partnership group, and 2/3 of them were there. So is that enough to get a decision through? Does it meet their governance requirements? Is there enough trust with the folks that were in the room, that weren't in the room? So it's nuanced, but I think if you get the right people in the right room at the right time with the right agenda and the right focus, then you can come up with something that has a lot of longevity to it. I think if you want to go far, as they say, go together. If you want to go
Hmm.
fast, go alone. Well, most of the
Hmm.
organizations engaged in long-term strategic planning, it's the conference, you have to go together with other folks.
Right, right. So I have some clients that are pretty convinced, along the lines of what you said, that their entire 150 cohort company needs to be in the same room at the same time when they come up with the strategy. Yeah, the look on your face tells me. So
Can I make
at
a
100 of,
joke about that? I just tell people like, how hard is it to pick a restaurant for 10 of your friends? Hard enough. let alone dictating, $100 million business. You can't do that by consensus. You can get engagement by consensus. You can't do decision making by consensus all the time.
Right. So I try to explain that also, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But at what point do you, I have a number in mind. At what point do you think there's too many people in the room? When do you start to think that I now have one too many, as opposed to just the right amount? Along the lines of what you said, we need just the right number and not one person more. Where for you is kind of the right blend of leadership, if you get the top leaders in the company?
So I did the strategic planning for the Reserve Bank of Fiji, and they had 40 people in the room. And I
Mm,
haven't seen everything from every part at the end of it, but I would say, hey, for them, that made a lot of sense. For
hmm
another organization, I had two people in the room, and that was exactly what they needed. But I would say kind of 7 to 11, you have your executive leadership or your board or both. Having both is hard.
Yeah.
One or the
hmm
two, and then that is typically around 12 people. I'd say after 12 people, diminishing returns. I think at least five, only if it makes sense.
Hmm. My magic number that I tell my clients is 20.
Oh, okay.
And it went up from 18 because I got pushed back on the 18. Oh, we can't decide. That's too hard. We'll have to exclude people who are really important. So it wasn't, it wasn't that they didn't buy my argument. It was that it was too politically hard to not bring in these other people. So they had to be brought in. And then I've had some who just snuck in a bunch of people who they just didn't tell me. I just looked around the room and said,
Oh, Jesus.
we have 30. How do we get to 30 from 20? They just told people to come, and I couldn't stand at the door and say, well, hold on, the numbers are too high.
Let me check your
And
tickets.
before I knew it. But these are the issues that Phil has to grapple with before he even makes the case. Because folks, in essence, there's a right number and a right design for an organization, so that at some point in time, a critical mass of employees and executives and board all cross the point of decision and start to implement it together. And there's not like a magic that you could do to have everyone pass at the same time. Matter of fact, is it even possible to get everyone? There's going to be the 5% or 10% who are completely resisting. So it sounds as if maybe there's a model in our minds, Anthony, you and I, that operating separately, that we sort of think of, that we're trying to optimize implementation and engagement at the end of the day. And we're looking down the road and we're wondering, okay, given the organization, given the personalities, given the ownership, given the board or lack of a board, given all these factors, how do we put them together in a way that sort of gets everyone across the finish line in the best way possible? Is that fair enough, or?
Yeah, I might even add another level of nuance to it. Let's say you have a 200-person organization. You start off the process, and generally speaking, 30% of them are dissatisfied or against the vision. Well, throughout this process, you might see that -30 to drop down to -10, right? To your 10% or whatever, 5, 10%. So then you have folks that you've brought forward, but maybe not across the line yet. And so the challenge with that is that all of these take time. And, sometimes that progress, that awareness, that recognizance that you have brought people with you doesn't show up for like a year and a half, 2 years, because you might not have been able to actually talk to them. They have, distinct from being actively engaged, you see them running, they went
Mm-hmm.
from opposed to neutral to slightly bought in. They're not going to be shouting from the rooftops, but they're still on your side. And so
Mm-hmm.
balancing that progress and recognizing that sometimes it takes a really long time for that progress to show outwardly doesn't mean it's not there. It just doesn't always show up like you might think screaming from the rooftops.
Yeah, I guess if we could give our executives, our clients, kind of magical powers, we would want them to appreciate the entire process and not just one event, but that this is the beginning of something in which people are transforming over time and they're engaging in different ways over time. So it's a timed and very nuanced and multi-factored kind of shift, as opposed to just a strategy, and a strategy that gets documented, and then that's it. And all of it, it's actually a process rather than an event. Is that sort of an accurate way?
Well, yeah, and then it's a function of energy that you put into it. So thinking of, an object at rest stays at rest.
Mm-hmm.
Because you had one strategy meeting does not mean it's going to move the culture along, does not mean it's going to move buy-in, does not mean it's going to execute. You need to put time, money, energy, focus into it. Again, this is not giving advice, it's just looking at, you get what you put in. And
Mm-hmm.
if you consistently put in effort, like going to the gym, for example, if I go to the gym one time for an hour, it's going to be very different than me doing a 20-minute workout every single day for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
You're obviously going to get a lot more results with the sustained commitment. But it takes a long time. Same thing, putting that energy in, and then the fits and spurts. Well, you'll get fits and spurts results. So, yeah.
Right, right. And that consistency also builds trust. It gets better inputs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, makes me wonder. Have you seen over time that employee input has improved? I think it could just be my wishful thinking, right? So I don't know if this is true. Hence my reason why I'm asking. But 20 years ago, if you were to ask employees what questions around strategy, I would get, I think I would get very either nothing or very basic answers, or I don't know, or a feeling like it should be up to somebody else, or why are you bothering me with that? Or that's not my job, or some version of, it's not disengagement, but there just wasn't that capacity
Mm-hmm.
at one level, that interest and that training. But now, 20 years later, from my own experience, it seems as if employees have gotten just better. They're just more informed. They have read more. They've been exposed. They're better trained. They sort of are waiting to be called on rather than assuming that they will never be called on.
Mm-hmm.
So they're more prepared for conversations of a strategic nature. Well, it could just be a generational thing as well. But what do you make of my observation? Do you see any evidence of that?
I do, and I would attribute it to bargaining power in
Really?
in the sense that, let's call it, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, all of the power lived with the employer. People stayed for 20, 30 years. You knew who you had. There was very low, turnover or movement or whatever. In addition, the tools for actually soliciting feedback were, relatively limited. Now that you have an emphasis on inclusion generally, the fact that you want to make sure that your employees are happy versus they're getting a paycheck, they should be happy, they should shut up and smile and just be grateful, versus like, hey, if I don't engage this person, if I don't provide room for advancement, if they aren't satisfied with their job, they're going to leave and they're going to go somewhere else, and that is expensive for me. And so I think that, like, the economics of power being with the employee lends to wanting to have something that is more engaging, having them have an opportunity to feel like a contribution, et cetera, et cetera. And then additionally, generation expectations of, you're expected to be asked versus you're expected to just kind of put up with it. So I think those are like a bunch of different changes. And then, of course, the ability to, everybody has an opinion, they share it freely. And then so soliciting that is also a additional change to the system.
Interesting. You picked up the phone, because I imagine that what's going to come in the future is that you and I are already seeing, I'm sure, that people are using their phones and their devices in a way that in this planning retreats that they never used to in the past. So now they're armed with, used to be armed with, well, used to be a distraction, but now they're armed with Chat GPT. So they could, in the middle of a session, just poke holes in the conversation just because they have facts that nobody else has even considered. They could go find decent input that before a Google search, maybe if they got lucky, but they could, I've had cases where participants are recording the conversation in the retreat. So they're getting a transcript. They could feed that transcript into ChatGPT and say, or an LLM and say, what are we missing? And they actually could come up with something that's really valuable. So it's one thing to have others participate. It's another thing to have them participate with an LLM at their fingertips. I don't know. I'm not seeing that quite yet, but it's darn close. How about you?
I have never even considered that, frankly. I find it a cool tool for myself, but you just kind of blew my mind because, let's say you have a strategic planning session, and I don't think we're far from this given what you've shared it. You have 10 participants, and the 11th could be a large learning language LLM, whatever the word is right now.
Yeah.
Both to take notes, to log parking lot items. It could probably act as a facilitator. And it could probably, if somebody asked the question like, oh yeah, like what is the unit economics of this thing? You ask your specialty trained, whatever, and they could say your profit margin is $2 per unit. Okay, great. You have informed decision-making faster than saying, okay, let's park that. Let's figure it out. Let's try to make a decision based on that and move on. So I had never considered that, but I think that's an interesting technological place to move into.
I think it's coming. We actually have in set retreats, set exercises before a retreat, we're having them use LLMs. But I've not seen someone pull one out when I wasn't looking and then surprise us all with some, hey, listen, I've compared our strategy with the strategy of some competitor in Thailand or some faraway place. And guess what? They tried to do the same thing and they failed and add that kind of value. But I suspect we're just kind of minutes away from that kind of input.
Well, see, I'm curious if people will be keen to put their strategies into any kind of tool, GPT or otherwise, that, then it becomes like open source. But if you made your own, I think making your own strategic planning tool model type thing would be very special, and it would disrupt a lot of software industries, etc.
Right. So this engagement thing might blow up on us. Next year, by the time we're talking, we might have some horror stories or some great stories, depending on what people are going to do, what our clients are going to do with us. They may insist that one person needs to be on the computer checking an LLM while we're having our session, because that's the only way that they know that they're not going to get blindsided. But anyway, let's go a little bit into solutions. And before you were sharing kind of a moment when you were in your first strategic planning retreat and where you went from one place to another. Could you share that with us? Sort of give us an idea of what brought you into this idea of engaging people in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah. And so it being my first strategic planning retreat, it was before I facilitated strategic planning retreats professionally. But I was on the board of directors of an organization. It had a couple staff, so nothing major, but a lot of community contributions. And they said, for us to be able to do our work as a board and get everybody engaged, we're going to go to this island. So it was offsite. We took a small boat there and went and stayed overnight for a couple days. And it's the first time I had ever seen a facilitator, like a person whose job it was to solicit ideas and support idea like generation and that kind of stuff, walk through an agenda. And, given that this was some time ago, I remember wanting to contribute, being relatively new, caring a lot about the organization, and wanted to do what I could. So I was showing up as a relatively new director. There was folks that had been there for a while. I think that there were some folks that were a little bit more, I'll say, seasoned. So not necessarily maybe a little bit tired of doing the work, but who knows? And, through the process, I didn't walk in saying, I want this, other than I want to be able to contribute and I want to know where we're going, because I wanted to be able to support that and do my job. I think other people in there had, like the executive director and the staff, they wanted some direction. And I remember it being I'd be happy at the end that leaving that I could contribute, and happy that I like got to know these people. But also recognizing that there was so much more that I didn't know. Like I learned more than I expected, because there was just so much about the organization I didn't know, so much about other people that I didn't know. There were those serendipitous moments where I'm like, oh, yeah, we totally could do that. Or, oh, that's a great idea that has nothing to do with me, but that wouldn't have come up. Relationships that help build trust and make our future meetings there, because we always had this thing that we could reference. Oh, yeah, we talked about this in the retreat, or, oh, this challenge that we worked through. And then the time and space to step out and just not have any distractions. Again, this is relatively pre-cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it was just a really valuable experience that I think the executive director could have probably just said, here's our strategy, here's a document, go. But it really would have limited, I was going to say engagement, but I would have had no place. I would have said, that's that person's document. Okay, I guess I'll like stamp it, versus
Yeah.
being part of the process and getting to kind of challenge the ideas, to bring different thinking, to bring my perspective as somebody who knew a little bit, but wasn't so stubborn thinking I knew everything. It
Right.
might surprise some of your listeners that I wasn't thinking I knew everything. And yeah, and just like really got to a place where everybody worked better together. It was a more effective team. We got more done. And it ultimately like moved the organization towards the next place that we were trying to get to. So it was awesome.
Well, it sounds as if you made some decisions about, because here you are, so you must have, something had to happen and you made a decision to pursue what the work you do, and to do it in the way that you do it. Because some people could go to a strategy retreat and say, ooh, and they're watching a presentation made by outside consultants, and they're thinking, oh, I'd like to do that kind of thinking and present to people and tell them what to do. So they come away with exactly the opposite reaction that you had.
Mm.
But what was it or how did you go from where you were at the end of that retreat to where you are now, being the facilitator? How did you make that transition? What led you into that direction?
Yeah, so I obviously didn't facilitate this one. I was a partner, and I
Mm-hmm.
think I remember that there was somebody who called in and like did a talk, and like the difference between the talk that everybody was just like painfully sitting there and listening to, which is, there's a time and place for those, and then actually being able to contribute. The facilitator was good. It kept the 2 days being fun. It fueled my addiction for post-it notes, like
Never leave home without them.
gateway for that. No, it was just, I mean, it was such a valuable tool to getting things done, that as I saw, as somebody who wanted to work with teams, who saw the value of, you know, I'm a soccer player. You want everybody on the pitch involved at the same time, like 11 people, not just
Mm-hmm.
one or two. Like you have to win as
Mm-hmm.
a team. And I believe that success is a team sport. And that was at the time one of the best ways I saw to get everybody engaged, to recognize everybody had their strengths. And it was a great
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to leverage respective strengths as well as team strengths. Uh,
Okay.
and it was just a lot of fun and got a lot done. Got a lot done in 2 days versus, hum hawing and, talking about something else. So, yeah. And then now here I am, several hundred strategy offsites led later. Still track it back to that one.
Oh, well, and it sounds as if the team approach, you already had the team approach from playing football or soccer. Was it soccer football, or
Soccer,
football,
football.
American football?
Yeah, football, soccer.
Soccer football, right? Okay, real football. For those of us who aren't in the United States. So you already had that background and you knew what it was like to be in a fluid team environment with 11 people relying on each other. Um, and as things happen, the team would react to them. Um, how does that sort of experience and the teaming, the propensity to team, how does that get translated into what you recommend to clients in terms of the approach that they follow? Is there a framework or a steps 1, 2, 3 that you could leave with us, or maybe the process that you follow that sort of encapsulates some of what we've been talking about?
Yeah. So I'll talk about our process that we think about, and it's all around alignment, making sure everybody has the same
Okay.
objective. We talked about strategy earlier, of course, and that's like at some choices. And, like if we follow the football example, and I don't use sports for everything, but, against different opponents, you approach a different strategy. You have to have approach different tactics. If your strategy for your business was one thing 10 years ago, it shouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
the same as now because the world is so different, And so if you're just copy and pasting, and then so in terms of like that unlocking strengths piece of it, when we look and say, hey, here's where we are, here's where we want to go, here's what's gonna get in the way, and those are the first 3 steps of our alignment program. Here, where are we now? Where we want to go? What's going to get in the way? What are the things that we need to prioritize in terms of strategies? And then what doesn't show up all the time in our kind of outward documentation is who's going to do it? Who is playing the lead on the 1, 2, 3 strategic priorities to make sure that as of the day that we're doing the strategy, those are the most important things and those are the people. There might be other priorities in year 2 or year 3, year 4, or year 5 that require different strengths, which require different people. So we might have to change it. But just because you're not one of those 1, 2, 3 people doesn't mean you're not contributing to the work. You might be supporting that one person. You might be on a team with that one person. You might be supporting somebody who's another level away or another level away. But if it's an organizational strategic priority, that's our game plan. Here's our keys to the game. Here's the 1, 2, 3 things we need to do to win. And if not everybody playing the game knows the plan for how they're going to win, how are you going to have a chance in heck at actually making it happen if only half the team knows what the plays are? One of us is going over there, one of us is going over there. It doesn't win. Like we all need to be in on it. And so I find that like team approach, that building trust approach, when we think of alignment, it's alignment at 3 levels. It's alignment with the direction, it's
Mm-hmm.
alignment with the priorities, and it's
Mm-hmm.
alignment with the entire organization. And if you don't have
Mm-hmm.
all of those things in alignment, you're not going to move your plan forward.
Right. It sounds also as if you are really committed that people have that kind of learning experience that you had in your first retreat, where you learned all these things about the organization and you had conversations that you'd never had before, and you discovered and the serendipitous moments happen. That you're also committed that people who end up in a retreat of yours walk away being better and more connected. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, and you just demonstrated what's so great about having a facilitator. So, like, even in this interview, even though that we're literally talking about my life here, I discovered a thing that might have been so obvious, but even as a reflective practice, I was like, oh, you're right. I had never thought about that before. You weren't there. You didn't see me. You don't need to know any about those things. But because you're able to like really listen, you're able to provide me with a whole new perspective of my life that I didn't have 5 minutes ago. And you don't need to be, and that the other thing is you don't need to be the expert in my life. So sidebar around, we want to make sure that there's a specialist in our industry that is facilitating this process. You don't need that. You just need to have some people that are really good at asking questions and really good about hearing what's said and what's not said. And you did that masterfully, Francis. So thanks for that.
And you did it back to me also masterfully. Thanks for that. Because frankly, I've never had that thought before that you mentioned about people walking away learning in that way. But it then leads me to think that it prepares them for the next retreat, a year, 2 years, 5 years, whenever, because they've been through this process. They actually become better managers in the meantime, but they also become better strategists. So you're in a positive loop.
Yeah.
We're engaging them deeply.
Well, I think about it as like in that case, it would be a spiral, upward spiral, if we use
A
the loop.
spiral. Uh-huh.
But how we think about it as steps, when we facilitate, we're not just teaching the concepts. Otherwise, we can check
Uh-huh.
a box, we could do it. It's really, or we're not just going through it. It's, hey, we want to teach it so that people are better. Every time you have a strategy meeting, you should be a better strategist, better manager, better leader, be prepared to ask better questions. If you have 12 strategy meetings over the year, let's call it a monthly meeting,
Right.
you have your offsite, You have 12 strategy meetings. Imagine how much better everybody is going to be at the next strategy offsite a year. So you're building a better team. You're using strategic thinking as a tool. It's not just creating the plan, but it's investing in the team to be better managers and leaders. And it's especially important with managers who grew up through the organization because they were technically good. There are some people who are great
Right.
people managers, don't understand the job. There are people who really understand the job and are bad people managers. They both happen to be in positions of leadership. You have to treat them differently.
Right. And it also strikes me that people get a better understanding of the other units, so they become more valuable to the business because of the way that you do it. So the interconnection gets deeper and deeper and deeper, so that again, when they get together a year from now, those interconnections play out in ways that you can't quite predict, but you benefit from anyway because you invested time in this kind of to get we're all together kind of approach. It
Well,
seems as if it has its own benefit.
Well, if you think of, our friend Phil from earlier, his
Mm-hmm.
organization is likely operating in silos. There's no communication
Right.
paths moving across. So
Right.
how could you support your fellow person? And then if you're actually trying to drive organizational change means everybody in the organization, not a department. And so for most organizations that are really trying to elevate, you can't just
Right.
elevate one component. You have to elevate all the components. And so how can you do that if not everybody's engaged in the same process?
Right. I don't know there's any way to not in a profound way that creates that spiral that you talked about, that Phil must contend with. If I want to enter this spiral, then there's a human requirement, or there's like a way to do it.
Mhm.
Anthony, boy, I learned about what I do from listening to you. It's so interesting. But how can folks hear more about the alignment process and the work that you're doing at SME?
Yeah, I think Francis, always pleasure. SMEstrategy.net. If you look at our approach, it talks about how we think of strategic thinking, not just strategic planning, prioritization, how we think about communication, how we think about implementation, not just doing the stuff, but building the environment around the plan. So we call it our critical capacities. You can connect with me on LinkedIn for more on this. And then I talk strategy, all over the place. So, yeah, Francis, pleasure always. And lots. We're both spending upwards now. So thank you for that too.
That I know won't forget that spiral picture in my mind of spiraling upwards. That's going to be my new sort of frame of reference for the work that we do. Because I always think linearly, but spiraling upwards is like, ooh. Ooh.
Well,
So,
if
folks,
you're looking at it from top down, it looks like you're not moving. Just as another perspective.
true, that's true too, from a particular perspective. So, folks, thanks for joining us. Drop a note in the comments. Let people know the value that you got from this particular take, because there's other videos that you could be and will be listening to here at the conference. So I'll see you in another video. And thanks, Anthony, for joining us.
Pleasure always.
Alrighty. Take care, folks.